So I wanted to show you basically after we have some poly painting information, if we have UVs on our model, we can actually capture that to a texture. So I'm going to go ahead and clear the canvas. For those of you that are just kind of curious how you put multiple versions of your character on the screen, you can just tap Shift S and that'll take a snapshot, and then you can move over another version of your character, hit Shift S again, and then maybe do a back view or something like that at that point. So if you want to clear the canvas, Control N, that's going to clear out the canvas. And from the last video, I did some more work to this model, just added more colors to the color range, added some oranges, and lighten up certain areas, adding more spots, things like that. So I'm starting to get pretty happy with the color patterns and things like that, and the way that the cracks are looking on this character. So I'm going to go ahead and just capture the poly painting information that I've put on here, and I'm going to capture that in a texture. So in order to do that, let me hide this brush palette. You should see tool over here to the side. If you open this up and we go to the UV map, here's where we can set the size of the map that we're going to output. So if you want a 1024, you can click on this. If you want a 2048, you can click on this, 4096. So that's going to give you your map size. If you want to check your UVs and just kind of see what the UVs look like, you might want to hit this Morph UV. And it might take a little bit of time, but it'll basically take your model and flatten it out into UV space so you can kind of see what that texture is going to look like with the UVs. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click that back, and after that we can just open up this texture map area, and we could say new texture. If we do that, it should fill whatever this foreground color is. So you can see that happens here. So it looks like the poly painting information goes away, but basically the poly painting information is still there. If you want to turn this texture off, you can click this texture on or off right here with this. Okay, so you can see the poly painting is still there. If we want to create a texture from the poly painting, we can open up this create, and we can say new from Polypaint, and it should go through and it should capture that image for us. Okay, so now we're seeing on the model, this is actually texture. This is no longer poly painting, because you can see the textures on here, and it's pretty darn close to what you're going to get with the poly painting versus the texture. Okay, now if you want to get this texture out of the program, you can't just kind of leave it here in this slot over here. We're going to have to do something to it to get it out of the program. So to get it out of the program, we're going to have to hit this clone texture, and it's going to send it from this texture that exists on the model, and it's going to throw it into our normal texture area. Okay, so I'm going to hit clone texture. You can see it's going to make a new texture over here for me, and it's going to be flipped upside down probably for what you need in Photoshop and maybe Maya or Max or whatever your 3D program is that you're going to be using this texture in. So if you want to flip it inside of ZBrush, you can go to texture and you can say flip V, and that'll flip vertical. Obviously this is going to flip horizontal. So I've got this here, and that's going to give me the correct orientation for the texture. Now at that point, I'm going to click either here and say export, or if I was just wanted to stay in this texture area, there's an export here. So you can go ahead and hit export, and then you can save that thing out as a texture. You can save it out as a Photoshop document, JPEG, BMP, TIFF. I usually just use Photoshop textures just because basically I'm going to pull this into Photoshop and probably do some more things to it. So I might as well just start off in Photoshop, but depending on maybe what you're going to do with this, you might want to save in a different file format. Okay, so that's basically how we can convert the poly painting information to a texture and then get that out of the program. Again, remember, you're going to have UVs for that. Okay, so this can be a step that you save for the very end. I just want to show it kind of up front in case anybody wanted to start kicking out textures right away, but there's no reason why you could be working on a model with no UVs and you color the entire, like all the different objects within that scene. You can totally do that and then drop down to your lowest subdivision level, take it to another program like Maya 3D Studio Max, and reset up the UVs, import that back in, and then kick out these textures later. So it's kind of the cool thing about polypainting is it's making an environment to where an artist can just kind of create. An artist can just sculpt, an artist can just paint, and they don't have to worry about a lot of these different technical requirements. And then later on, if you need to get this stuff out of the program, then you can do the technical things and capture all the work that you've already done in your previous sessions and get that in a format that other programs will be able to use. There's one last thing I would like to show you in this video segment, and that is basically how we can take a texture like this and we can use the spotlight tool within inside of ZBrush to make additional changes to this texture after we've captured it from Polypaint. So the first thing we have to do is move this texture into the general texture area, and to do that we just say clone texture, and if we go to the texture tab, let me go ahead and click this and drag this over. I've got this texture that I can start working with, and I can go ahead and hit this add to spotlight button. It's going to open up the light box. I'm going to comma to close this up here, and then now I'm kind of working with this texture like what we looked at earlier with adding the swatches. But basically I wanted to show you that we could play with things like there's intensity, so click on the image and then we'll click on intensity, and then we can click and drag this radial slider and we could turn down the intensity or we could crank it up. And if we want to put it back to the original, we kind of get that little slider tick right down there at the bottom. Okay, so we can play with that. There's also hue, so we could click on this and then start to change this radial dial, and we could change the hue of the texture. So I'll go ahead and leave that there like that so we can see a big change. And then we could also click on saturation. You can click on that and we could overdrive the saturation if we want, or we could lessen the saturation. I'll go ahead and kind of decrease the saturation a little bit on this. And then we could take a look at contrast. So we could lessen the contrast, or we could make the contrast, this is actually lessening the contrast, and this direction is going to kind of increase that. So if I drag this way, let's just see what looks kind of good. I'll kind of put it right about here. And then from there, it would be a matter of we can just kind of close out of the lightbox tool. So that's here in the texture area. We can go ahead and turn that off. The hotkey for that again is Shift Z, so we can turn that off. But in the texture tab, that's actually going to make a change to the texture here. So if we want to push those texture changes and then push them to our model, we're going to go to the Tools section, go here to the Texture tab, and then we can actually select this right here. So you can see here's the new changes that we made to that texture with Spotlight. So this is texture, but if we wanted to push this to where we're polypainting, remember if we turn the texture off, you can see that we're back to the original version that we have. So if we want to take this texture and push this to Polypaint, then we have to go to the Polypaint area and then say Polypaint from texture. And go ahead and click that. Actually, it's telling me that I need to have RGB mode turned on. And if I have the RGB intensity turned down like really low, like 10, I can say Polypaint from texture, and it'll start to fill that. But if I want full intensity, then I need to crank that all the way to 100% and say Polypaint from texture. And you can see now my model is doesn't have a texture on it. This is actually Polypaint, but it's taking the texture information that we had, and then it's turning that into Polypaint. So that's the basic workflow that you can get to move back and forth between the two. So again, if I wanted to make some kind of change to the model, say I just wanted to add some of this dark kind of shading, and I'll go ahead and paint on this part back here, kind of darken up the head a little bit like that. Maybe darken up the back of this character so it's something that we can easily see. Then again, if I want to push that to texture, then I would just go and say new texture from Polypaint. So here's my new texture that was generated from the Polypaint, and we're looking at it this way. Okay, and I believe if we want to get that texture back that we originally had before the change, I can just go ahead and select that earlier version. And if I want to go new from Polypaint, I'll do that again. That's going to switch it, and I can say clone texture. Now at that point, you should see I've got two different versions to kind of work with here in this trough. So I could select this texture here or this change here. So it's kind of like building a little mini kind of change list or changes in texture that you've done that way as well. So that's how we can use Spotlight to do additional changes to our texture and then pull those changes back in to Polypaint. I've shown you Spotlight, but there's no reason why you couldn't kick that texture out to Photoshop, do manipulations inside of Photoshop. You could paint on it, add certain things, pull it back in here by saying import, and then once it's in that texture tab, you can pull that texture in through here and then convert it to Polypaint. So you've got a nice little workflow for creating things in Polypaint, converting it to texture, doing changes in ZBrush, or you can do changes in Photoshop, and then bring those changes back and then keep kind of working in whatever manner that you wish.